Hi, it's Jen Taub. Welcome back to Booked Up, a podcast that features you, me, and our favorite authors. We release a new episode every Sunday morning. Today, for the October Book Club, my friends Jen Rubin and Brian Karem are joining me to discuss Cassidy Hutchinson's new best-selling memoir, Enough. Unless you have been living under a rock, which honestly sounds kind of pleasant given the current overwhelm, you know Cassidy Hutchinson is a former special assistant to President Donald Trump and his chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Cassidy became a public figure when she appeared as a key witness in June of 2022 before the House Select Commitee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. The world watched her testify under oath that Donald Trump knew his supporters were armed and angry, and that Donald Trump physically assaulted his own driver in a failed attempt to force him to take him from the eclipse to the Capitol, where the violent mob would then gather. Cassidy's bombshell testimony took place during what I'd like to call the before times, meaning this was just before when the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago in August of 2022 to search for the purloined national security documents. Her testimony was before a special counsel, Jack Smith, was appointed in November to investigate her former boss, both for those documents, the documents he was hoarding, and for the insurrection. Her testimony was also before Donald Trump was indicted by a New York grand jury in Manhattan, a federal grand jury in Florida, a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C., and a Georgia grand jury in Fulton County. All this is to say her testimony felt like a watershed, felt like maybe things would move forward. And though these are not correlated with that, it was just this moment, a breakthrough moment. And after that came the flood. With Enough, we learned so much more from Cassidy about her painful family history and the adults around her who finally did support her so she could find the strength to tell the truth and stand up to one of the world's biggest bullies. To talk about Enough, my guests today are Jennifer Rubin and Brian Karem, both prolific journalists and book authors. Jen writes a column for The Washington Post where she covers politics and policy, both foreign and domestic, and provides insight into the conservative movement, the Republican Democratic parties, and threats to Western democracies. Prior to her career in journalism, Jen practiced labor law for 2 decades, an experience that informs and enriches her work. Jen Rubin is the author of Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. And she is also the host of the podcast Jen Rubin's Green Room, put out also by Politicon, just like Booked Up. And Brian Karem is an award-winning journalist, Emmy-nominated reporter, and author of 7 books, including Free the Press, The Death of American Journalism, and How to Revive It. Brian Karem is a veteran White House correspondent and former senior correspondent for Playboy magazine. He currently writes a weekly column on the White House for Salon.com. He is also a frequent guest on numerous radio shows throughout the U.S., Canada, and Europe. And Brian hosts his own podcast called Just Ask the Question. Okay, let's dive in. Hey, Jen and Brian, it's so good to see you again.
It's lovely to be here.
Good to be seen.
This is, I guess it's Thursday, October 26th. And when we're talking, and I don't know if I've ever felt like the world was melting down more quickly than right now. And I feel like I want to acknowledge that and how you both, I guess, starting with you, Jen, how you're hanging in there with the world news, national news, and just this barrage of litigation that we're supposed to be all on top of involving the former president.
It is really at times too much. Between the news of Israel, the reaction in the United States to the news in Israel, the selection of an election denier as Speaker of the House,
right,
the ongoing war in Ukraine, it's a bit much sometimes, even for us. And you try to keep positive. I take great solace in the fact that Biden is in the White House and has really been doing a masterful job on foreign policy. And we get very, very good economic news today with 4.9% third quarter growth. And yet the rest of the world is, and the United States is at times spinning out of control.
How do you, just to follow up on that, on a sort of like, how do you kind of re-anchor or reset yourself emotionally so that you don't feel yourself kind of reflecting that lack of control?
You know, I have a community of colleagues and associates. I met with some recently in out of town, and it was very reaffirming. I think in these times you have to find people who are intellectually, emotionally important to you, grounded to you, and that provides a lot of emotional support and also practical advice of what we can all be doing.
I like that. And you, Brian, I mean, you also, like Jen, are right there in Washington, and you're literally close, right in there in the White House, watching some of the things she's talking about. How are you reflecting on the world events and specifically what's happening right there?
Well, I've just grown constantly amazed. It was George Carlin who said he started adjusting when he divorced himself from humanity and looked at it as just outside of himself. And I guess that's the only way to do it. I mean, I was in Congress the other day for the last 3 weeks watching the nonsense in Congress, which reminded me, honest to God, if you ever read Lord of the Flies, our new Speaker of the House is Piggy. But if you read Lord of the Flies, that's Congress. And I ran into a colleague of mine in Congress, and he goes, "This, people are running around literally almost with their hair on fire, and they're, my God, this chaos, I've never seen anything like it. Brian, how are you handling it?" I'm going, "Well, you've had 3 weeks of it." I said, we saw this before. I've seen this before. This was the Trump administration for 4 years. So it's nothing new. And after a while, you get used to it. You do where you can. You put out what you can when you can. Now I feel like I'm quoting Jimmy Carter. Do as much as you can with what you've got for as long as you can. And so that's what keeps you kind of sane through it all. And acknowledging the fact that on the international stage, and so yesterday the Australian Prime Minister was in the White House, and acknowledging the fact that on the international stage, America now has a far better reputation than it did under the 4 years of Trump is helpful. But the biggest contrast for me, and what really brought it home as to the times we're in, is on Tuesday, while the prepubescent pustules in Congress were going nuts and couldn't pick a speaker, and, they're left with their bottom of the barrel.
I would say Republicans in Congress, just to correct you, because the Dems already had unanimity around Hakeem Jeffries for a long time. But go ahead.
The House as a whole had not been able to pick a speaker. And so as I had just gotten back from the Hill, there was a wonderful ceremony for scientists being awarded things in the White House. So there I am in the East Room. Wide diversity of human beings. I mean, every religion, race, creed, whatever, for doing what is essential work for us and for our culture, and the advancements they had made in everything from botany to heart disease to eye disease to biomechanics to the internet and computers and cosmology. And you're sitting there in this room full of people, and a couple of them look like, your cliched scientist. It was, it was kind of fun. But at the end of it, I said, there still are very smart people on the planet. It's just that we don't get any of them in Congress. So and we got to blame ourselves for that. It's garbage in, garbage out. But there still are wonderfully bright people on the planet, and I place my faith in that.
That's wonderful,
this makes
Brian.
Me happy.
And of course, we didn't even mention yet, it's like the fifth thing down, the list is this horrendous mass shooting in Maine.
Right.
This is, we are killing ourselves. And as the vice president said today, we are choosing this. We don't have to operate this. We don't have to live this way. It's a choice. And people would rather put their careers and their pocketbooks and their stature above the lives of their fellow human beings. And it's very sad and very frustrating.
For me, the saddest part of that was I picked up, I get all my news on my phone, my news alerts. So while I'm in the White House, if something happens, I can at least stay abreast of what's going on, which is how we were able to ask the president about the new speaker yesterday, because they, anointed him speaker as we were sitting in the Rose Garden. And one of the things that came across my phone was I saw 27 people dead, 40 injured. And I go, oh my God. But I looked again. That wasn't about the shooting in Maine. It was about the hurricane in
Mexico.
In Mexico. But the thing that struck me is we do that much damage ourselves in the United States. It doesn't take a hurricane to kill 27 people. A nut job with a couple of guns can do it. So we destroy ourselves. And I look at both those headlines. I actually almost chuckled at how God awful that was, to realize that we don't need a hurricane in the United States to kill 27 people. We do it twice. There are, twice a week? I think it's twice a week. There are mass shootings in the U.S. this year. So we do it ourselves. What
I was also thinking is, how, on the one hand, how scary it is that the suspect is at large, but the suspect is always at large. I mean, that's where we are right now. And I feel for young people in our country, but I love this idea of maybe it would be very healing and good to turn my attention to the things that you described, science and people making interesting things in businesses that are actually employing people, making decent products. There are those sort of positive things happening in the world, not trying to draw our own attention to chaos. I'm not saying ignore the problem with not even having red flag laws in Maine. I want to be active in change, but I just want the cacophony of needless conflict and bloodshed not to be at the forefront of everything every day, which is what it's been feeling like for me since October 7th. But that brings us to this book, which, Cassidy Hutchinson's Enough, in some ways, I want to characterize it as the first draft of history. On the other hand, we are still living through that. And it's not over. It's just barely even beginning. And so maybe we can talk a bit about what I want to start with you, Brian, on this, about in terms of if you had met or interacted with Cassidy, and just sort of generally any take you have, your big picture takes on the book.
I had run across her. She was one of the, I knew her enough to say hi to her and, ask for a couple of things from her because she worked in the White House. And there was, I always tried to stay a little higher in the interaction chain because you can get more done that way, no matter who the president is. But I interacted with her. And as a first draft of history, I don't find it a first draft. And, I was there the day that, I asked the question, win, lose, or draw, will you, accept a peaceful transfer of power to the president? And we're living in his answer to that question now. And that was 6 weeks before the election. And what I find annoying, and I know she's young, so she's young as younger than my kids. And so those are the people that you tend to be a little more empathetic towards. But at the same time, these people knew what Donald Trump was from the day they walked in. And there were those who fought hard to help us. There were a few of them I could point to, but many of them swallowed, and I hate using that term, but took hook, line, and sinker, or turned a deaf ear or a blind eye to what Donald Trump did until they left the administration. And then they spoke up. And we were there every day, and they had ample opportunity to talk to hundreds of reporters on any given day. And there's a guy named Judd who was in there who was, we spoke with, and he told us, exactly what was wrong and why he stayed every day. There were others who didn't, and there were others who turned a blind eye, and that annoys me, because if you're going to come out with righteous indignation now, where was it then? Because there are people that were suffering then and now, and they knew what Donald Trump was up to. We all did. But Donald Trump was able to press his grift on the American people and the public at large, because people who knew better inside the administration kept their mouths shut until they left. And that goes all the way up the ladder, including, the guy who just made a deal, his former chief of staff, who says his own book is BS. Well,
Mark Meadows, right?
Yeah, I can't even stand saying the guy's name.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. It's just every day I'm interacting with these people, and every day they're lying to my face, including Cassidy, less because she had less to do with policy. But she knew what was up when we would ask questions. Others knew what was up. Mazel tov, God bless. I'm glad you came forward with this, but I'm sorry. I have little sympathy for those who are seeking, retribution or I don't know, a penance for what they did now, because they had a much better chance to make a difference then, and they didn't do it.
So, Jen, do you share that, or do you have a more charitable or nuanced view than Brian?
Well, I was going to
I love it, though.
I was going to be more generous. Now, Brian convinced me not to be. I think her age does give her a little bit of leeway.
Yeah.
She's very young. She should not have been in the White House in the first place, frankly, because she was so young and inexperienced, which is part of the problem. They put people in those jobs who had no idea what they were doing and who had no frame of reference. So she was in over her head from the get-go. And I do give her some credit, because she did come forward in the January 6th hearing at a time that we were kind of losing the thread. And when people much older, much more responsible, were keeping their mouths shut. So I think she deserves credit for that. But I would like to see some of these people explain what they are going to do. It's a funny word, but to atone for their role in this administration. Is she going to go out and educate young people about ethics in government? Is she going to go out and help register people to vote? Is she going to make a show of leaving the Republican Party and inducing other young Republicans to leave the party? I don't think you simply atone by doing the bare minimum of answering questions truthfully under oath. And I think all of these people have a debt they have to repay. Some people are going to be forced to do community service work because they've actually been indicted. But all of these people should feel like they have an obligation to the rest of us. And I would be very curious to see what her next chapter is. And I think getting a lot of praise now may be the wrong message to send to her. She hasn't done anything so extraordinary yet. She wants to help her country, help repair democracy. Get to work.
I love that thought. The thing that bothers me most about that was, she did come forward in January 6th when no one else would. I give her credit for that, because it cracked open a door. But at the same time, I can't give, my kids, if they acted as some of those kids in the White House acted, boy, they'd be in trouble with mom and dad. I mean, it's just, to me, there's a certain line you can't and shouldn't cross. And I don't care who's, manipulating you. You don't allow yourself to be manipulated. And everyone in that White House did. Every single last one of them. And that's to me was I think the worst thing that I saw out of that White House.
Can you give, from your experience, and any particular examples come to mind when you saw that kind of enabling, or the kind of behavior you're saying that if your kids engaged in, that you would be unhappy with them?
Everything I saw in the White House. I walked into that White House for 4 years, and I said to myself, it can't get worse than it was yesterday. And every damn day I was wrong. I was it's hard to be cynical when you're constantly amazed. I mean, I would hear Donald Trump yelling about the thermostat, screaming and ranting and raving about the thermostat, and people kowtowing to Rance Priebus running in there and, yes, Mr. President. I could hear this, and I'm 30, 40 feet away in upper press. I watched them lie for him. I watched them look. Nothing to me was more shocking and more telling about what that administration really was than in its last weeks, while they were publicly claiming they had not lost. Meanwhile, they're looting the White House like it's a fire sale at Walmart in mid-Missouri. I mean, you've got people running out with, and there's pictures of this, running out with framed artwork and with a bust of Lincoln. And then you would see when he left, when Trump would leave on Marine One, there'd be a train of assistants. And I think Cassidy may have been one of them. I can't remember. They were all so young and so diligent, and they're walking out with boxes that clearly say classified.
Right.
And for Mar-a-Lago, no more summons for me, folks. It's on video. And there was one young woman who's still with Donald Trump. And I'll tell you what it boiled down to at the end. There was a young woman in Margot, I think is still with him. And me and another reporter spoke with her. And she said she was going to go with Donald and work for him in Mar-a-Lago. And we said, don't. Whatever you do, get out. If you need a job, I'll help you find a job. And she said, I cannot find any other job. And now she's still working with him. And so that part is telling too. And Cassidy was part of that crowd. And Jen, you're so right. They were so young, but we had a lot of young reporters in there too. They shouldn't have been there.
Exactly. It also kind of reminds me, during the latest brouhaha over the speakership, Republicans were aghast that they were getting death threats. This administration, this former president, has been issuing death threats and sicking the mob on the press, on his political opponents, on business people, on all of us. And where were they then? It's only when it came home to roost and it was they who were potential victims, or they who saw them at the center of a potential legal disaster, that they spoke up. Where was the empathy for other people?
It didn't exist.
I'm so glad that you guys are taking this position, because there's something about enough where, whatever was going on wasn't enough to bother her. In other words, in the way the book is framed, you move from her childhood to her kind of being this wunderkind in the White House. She's extremely organized, very good at her job. But then all of a sudden it's, the election. Like we're skipping the babies in cages. We're skipping the Muslim ban. We're not really talking about, making COVID worse and denying the existence of the virus. She kind of, that's not part of this story. But I do want to focus on some of the stuff that comes out in this book that enhances our understanding, that goes beyond her testimony, that disturbed me the most. And that was how she was so ill-served by her lawyers, her first lawyer, I believe, Stephan Passantino. And I'm going to be really careful because he's already sued the January 6th committee as well as Andrew Weissman. And I don't really want to be sued. So in case he's listening, I'm not going to say anything other than what is in actually the book, and you can just go fuck yourself if you don't like that.
So, I love you, Jen.
What? I'm sorry. Isn't that right? But
I love it.
But the situation is, here she tried to find her own counsel, and no one would represent her. This is when she's subpoenaed early in when was it? Would have been in 2021, I think, when she would have been subpoenaed. I've lost track of the dates. And it's when she finally, she had gone through in early 2022, maybe it was 2022, but when she subpoenaed And she's sitting for these depositions, and Stefan Pasantino gave her advice that if I were her lawyer, would not have given her. And she was given a retainer letter to sign. And it appears, based on what she wrote in the book, that there were serious conflicts of interest. And she felt that he was she never knew who was paying the bills. She felt that he was tied to Trump World, tied to her former boss, Mark Meadows. And it looked as if she wasn't really his main priority in that representation. And it was when she realized, she looked in the mirror and could not live with herself based on her testimony, that she tried to find a way to send signals, sort of back channel signals, to Liz Cheney so she would be called again to testify. And I think that was what she did was extraordinary at that point. When she realized that what she needed to do, she did that. And then she finally was able to get her own counsel through Liz Cheney, through Alston and Byrd. And that changed the course of everything. And I guess what I'm saying about this is, when there are young people, it reminds me of the young people at accounting firms that participate in Accounting Frog. When you have young people fresh out of school who have no money but are very smart and ambitious and learn how to do what the adults want, which is how you do well in high school and college and all these things, but they don't know which adults they should actually trust. They can be heavily manipulated, and we don't think about I guess what I'm trying to say is, what about whether it's her or anyone else who does have a moment of a crisis of conscience and wants to do the right thing? Our legal system doesn't allow for people to break free without real risk. And she didn't. I mean, anyway. So I was really taken aback by what that looked like myself. Brian, what you're going to say?
Having spent time in the White House, I read over that portion of the book with a little bit of maybe jaundice. I don't know how to describe it any way else, because, Jen, you talked about threats. They weren't empathetic until the threats came against them. And none of them were, including her. I mean, I had my life threatened. Jim Acosta lived through, threats, and they made fun of him and made fun of others in the White House constantly. And they looked upon us as the enemy. As far as going to Liz Cheney in a back channel, that one confused me, because all you got to do is take your lunch break and walk down there and knock on the door. They would certainly talk to you. If she showed up and said, look, I needed to talk again. And by the way, she could back channels. All she had to do was talk to Liz's staff. You can walk into any congressional office. It's not that hard.
I think, though, but in fairness, Brian, she was afraid that she had perjured herself and she didn't know how to go about breaking.
But she had an opportunity. She had a lot of opportunity to clear that up prior to. And by the way, feeling she was trapped by her attorney, I don't give her the discount of youth there, because the simple fact of the matter is, by the time you're of age, you should have the understanding, particularly, I mean, I did, my children do, of what law is. And God bless, maybe that's because we grew up in a family of lawyers, but I think it's also part and parcel of education. There were plenty of attorneys I knew and still know that would have taken, and when I read that part about, she couldn't find a lawyer. What, in Washington, D.C., you can't find a lawyer who would be opposed to Donald? You got to be kidding me. I mean, I remember reading those pages going, yeah, I don't buy it.
She was saying, pro bono, you don't think?
Yeah, but come on, it's D.C. You can't shake a stick and not hit a lawyer around here. I know 2 or 3 of them that would have loved to have taken her case. I could name them if you want, but
no,
Mark Zaid being one of them.
Yeah.
Mine, Ted Boutros. I mean, and if they couldn't take it themselves, their firm and the firms, all the big firms, you get off the metro.
You're right. And she knows how to Google. She knows how to Google. She was able to find Alexander Butterfield on Google. She could have found Ted Boutros.
Right.
You make a point.
By the way, this is not Ruby Freeman, who is someone who is victimized, who is at a loss to access the legal system, who does not have a experience to draw on. She is a sophisticated, by her own mention, so well organized, so efficient, so able to access, well educated. So I think Brian is right. And I would also say, at the same time, lawyers have behaved horribly throughout this entire thing. I won't say anything about this lawyer, but we already have had, we're up to 3 lawyers who have pled guilty to serious misdeeds in Georgia. The legal profession behaved abominably throughout this. And they never stopped to think, are there going to be any consequences for me? Do I have an obligation above and beyond Donald Trump? They all treated it like a big game, that if they could come up with a clever enough idea, they could subvert democracy. And for someone like Kenneth Chesebro, for someone like Jenna Ellis, these people were really malicious. And I think the legal profession has to do some real self-evaluation about how we allow these sorts of people to get through law school, to get through practice, and to get the notion that this is all just hunky-dory. This is just part of the game. And I think that's one of the reasons I have been so adamant about demanding that these people all get disbarred, because that's really the only consequence. And there are others who are actively involved in that. But I think the problem goes deeper than this. And I think bar associations, which have been traditionally passive and have a built-in conflict of interest, because who pays the bar associations? It's the lawyers. I think judges, I think courts have been remiss. And I think they really have to look and see what kind of consequences they can build in and what are the incentives these days. And if you are in a big firm, why aren't there ethics people there to consult and to exercise some restraint? Law firms have a responsibility. They know what their characters are up to and how they're running around loose, setting little fires, little bonfires under democracy. So it's law firms, it's individual lawyers, it's law schools, it's the bar association, it's courts. And they all need to say, how did things get so bad? We had a period after Watergate where people had this kind of come to Jesus moment. I think we need another one.
There's one thing you just touched it. It's one of the things that the book brought up that you bring up, Jen, is that it's like living in a bubble. I ran community newspapers, and maybe that's the bubble that she was in, the Trump bubble. And how do you get out of the Trump bubble? Well, you Google, but the bubble of lawyers is huge too. When I was running, community newspapers, I remember we'd get the bar reports, who's been disbarred, I think they came quarterly, who's been reprimanded and why, and we would cover stories on it. And I can't tell you the number of times when I'd assigned a reporter to cover it, and the first thing from a lawyer was, "Why are you covering this?" It was already in the journal, or it was already, it's public. And I go, "Yeah, it's not really public until we do something about it." I think I'll push back a few. I go, "How are you going to push back? It's you're inside that bubble, and you think that, all right, I've been admonished by the bar. I'm still I haven't been disbarred." And so what I've done is acceptable. And it's hard to get your mind around once you're in that mindset or in that bubble among others who think as you do, that it's easy to get out. So for that, I will also give her a pass a little bit, but because I see lawyers do it all the time. And journalists do it. I mean, we sit in the White House and we talk amongst each other, and and it's like, and you wonder why there's stupid questions asked of people. It's because we live in this bubble, and nobody ever. Oh, you can't do that. Oh no. By the way, the networks aren't doing it, so it really isn't news. I mean, it's that we live in that world of competing bubbles, and we never get out of them. And so for that part, but. I would love to see a come to Jesus meeting out of this for politicians, for lawyers, and for the press.
So toward the beginning of our conversation, I was talking about this being a piece of history. And I want to, before I pivot to sort of where we are today, with, I mean, I can't keep track, not just of the Donald Trump cases, but like Sam Bankman-Fried, I'm supposed to be following that. I mean, there's just like, it's this, I mean, it's just, is this abundance of embarrassment of riches when it comes to the comeuppance that we are seeing. But before we get to, putting her book in that context, Brian, you mentioned that part about her childhood. And I wonder if there's, I don't think it's just that it builds empathy, how kind of abusive and dismissive her father was, but I think it might explain. I mean, she doesn't draw the line in the book, or a ghostwriter doesn't draw the line, but it does seem like there's some connection between the sort of bad father figure and who is irrational and yells and is a big Trump supporter, and maybe her willingness to not see Trump as a terrible guy because she has this family member who looks up to him. I mean, do you see that there? And she doesn't draw it draw that line directly, but it's
certainly reading between the lines is there. And my problem with that is, having raised 3 children myself, I mean, barring actual physical abuse, I mean, you're out on your own, and it's, all children rebel against their parents. When I was growing up, most of the liberal kids in my neighborhood were all the ones whose, fathers had the high and tight haircuts and were screaming, "Nixon's the one." So if you can think for yourself and you're out now professional on your own, I do get the parenting part of it. And it was an eye opener for me to read that, because that was never the young woman that we saw in the White House. Of course, we don't see much of except for the surface of people. You go through an entire life, and most of us never see beyond the surface of other people. So yeah, I get it. But again, what I kept coming back to as I was reading this was, why were you triggered on? It was only after you were personally threatened that there was a kickback or a pushback from here, and all the things that led up, in your life to this. I mean, that's what it took.
Well, to me, and this is where I'm going to be, when I look at this as a character study of a person, this is someone from a kind of lower to middle class family. Her father doesn't even go to her high school graduation. She applies to maybe one college. I mean, obviously very smart, very thoughtful person, and was starstruck by access to the White House. Your first job out of college, and you're there, it's so funny. I've been there now, and I was actually not starstruck by the time I got in there. I'm like, well, these ceilings are really low, and it feels like a rabbit warren. And how come no one's throwing a frisbee or having lunch out in the rose garden? This feels a little bit like not the best place to work when I was actually there. But I'm starstruck by some really good people like Blinken and people who do really amazing work at the White House. But if I had been in my 20s, it would be very hard. And maybe I'm just projecting onto her, because when I was in my 20s, well, first I worked at this big corporate law firm, which I liked. But then when I went in-house to this company, our senior management ended up going to prison for securities fraud. And so I think about myself being in my 20s and looking back after that happened at the red flags that I ignored. And so I just have so much empathy for somebody, like you're saying, who gets inside of a bubble into a groupthink. It could have been so much worse for me,
Well, but see, I was 25 when I first walked into the White House. First person I met was Helen Thomas. The second person I met was Sam Donaldson. I was starstruck. The history of it, I'd studied it. But at the same time, and then my story of meeting, Ronald Reagan, I walked upstairs, and with Sam and Helen, they're beating on the door, telling Larry Speakes to come out and speak to him. The Secret Service guy came through and said, "Hey, you all got to leave. The president's coming through to talk to Larry." They turned to leave. I turned. I'm 25. I was clumsy. I tripped and fell on my ass. And I'm on the floor. I'm on the floor. And I look over my shoulder, and I expect a Secret Service man to be over there ready to pound me or to, put me in cuffs. And who is it but Ronald Reagan? And Ronald Reagan looks down at me and says, "Well, young man, you don't have to bow in front of me." while I was,
this is why people loved him. That is the most charming.
Oh my goodness, that is a scream.
That's so funny.
While I was starstruck by the moment, I still knew who he was politically, and I was not starstruck by the criminality of that regime. And I still knew what I was dealing with. And so when I read that with Cassidy, that brought back memories of me being in the White House. And I go, yeah, but I still didn't know who Ronald Reagan was.
But you were a journalist.
Yeah.
You have a different, journalists.
That's true.
If you're a journalist, if you're like us, you're skeptical. Yeah. But if you're, go ahead, Jen, go ahead. Sorry.
I think there's a broader problem here, which is formation of moral character. That somewhere along the line, there should have been teachers, if her father was not a great, role model, teachers, some religious entity, some coach.
Or her mother or her stepfather.
Or her stepfather, exactly.
Right.
Who work on moral formation, that you have to take young people and say, give them the lessons of, you take one step and then, it's that much easier to take the second step. You don't fundamentally lie. I'll tell you a sad story. My younger son graduated from NYU Business School, and like all business students, they have to take a business ethics class. And they were given a hypothetical: is it okay to lie when you're interviewing and say you have another offer when you really don't? He was the only one in the class who said, no, it's not okay. That is a breathtaking statement on how kids get to a very sophisticated point in life, going to a very prestigious university, and they can't morally reason at that basic level. We have really, sunk pretty far. And that doesn't mean individuals don't have responsibility. Right. It doesn't mean, right. But there's something really wrong in our society that we're pumping out people who are so morally defective and morally tone deaf. And I think, it behooves us to kind of sit back and think, what messages are we giving young people about success? What messages, what are they being rewarded for? What are they being praised for? And what are the kind of building blocks of moral maturity that we need to make sure that goes into their education, their raising, their initial job requirements? Because we have a lot of people out there who are running around like moral idiots, and it's a real danger.
And that was everybody in that Trump White House, every single one of them.
Jen, I want to pick up the thread before we close about, you mentioned Watergate and how, as you probably are aware, professional ethics classes were instituted in law schools after that. And yet we say that there was this period, we think, and it appears that lawyers might have been definitely far more ethical than the Trump administration's lawyers, just by the sheer numbers that have been indicted or pleaded guilty or served jail time. But that is true. But then I think a lot about Watergate, and I think about, what are the incentives? Robert Bork was the guy at the Saturday Night Massacre who finally pulled the trigger and did the firings that no one else wanted to do. And what was his reward? He was nominated for years later to be on the U.S. Supreme Court. Right. So there is, loyalty in Bill. I mean, there is this thing about loyalty, and that loyalty is prized, I think, in the society more than honesty is.
Yeah, no, I think that is right. And I think people take great comfort in the I was only doing my job kind of routine. And, if you are a spokesperson for somebody in political office, in a corporation, you cannot lie. Being loyal does not mean that you lie. Now, you can emphasize positive facts. You can not comment. But you can't lie.
That's
and
right.
Something as basic as that, I think, has escaped people.
I would, if I were ever be hired to be a spokesperson, I would say, I will make you look good.
Right.
I will avoid embarrassing you, but I will never lie for you.
Exactly. And that used to be the rule, by the way, for press secretaries. That used to be the rule, that they would come right up to the line, but they would never mislead you, because as soon as they did, they lost credibility.
And the press won't trust them.
Right. And the press wouldn't trust them.
It's also wrong.
Right.
I mean, I couldn't live with myself. It's
right.
Not, right.
But that has gone way out the window. Yeah. That has gone way out the window. And they feel entitled to lie, and they think that's part of the job. They think that that's how the game is played.
Who was that guy under oath who said that very same thing at one of the hearings? I think it was around the same time that Michael Cohen had testified before that congressional hearing. Who? Not Sean Spicer. The other.
Well, no, I got a good.
No, the other guy. The guy who got in a fist fight with somebody or shoved somebody. I forgot his name, but on the campaign, he said, "Well, under oath, I have to tell the truth, but not otherwise."
Yeah.
Well, all of them were. Okay, Sarah did that. She admitted under oath that she lied to the press about.
Oh, Sarah Huckabee Sanders of the going to jail because of the lectern situation. Sorry, she's not going to go to jail. I didn't say that. I mean, but she's in a hot water, and I don't think it looks good for her.
No, none of those spokespeople for the Trump administration are, can be. I had a conversation with Sean, and here's how he put it to me. He said, "Brian, what if the president of the United States asked you to serve your country? Would you do it?" And I said, "Absolutely, Sean. If the president of the United States approached me and said, 'Will you serve your country?' I would absolutely do it. But let me tell you where I draw the line. The moment he tells me I have to go out into that press room and lie about the size of my inaugural crowd, I would understand at that point in time, I'm not serving my country. I'm serving him. And I would walk away from it immediately." Exactly. And I remember him saying, that's the difference between me and you. And I go,
oh God, yeah. I guess.
Well, that and the lime ruffle, the ruffled lime shirt is also the big difference. I can't see you wearing that.
Dancing with the Stars. I'm a better dancer too. Damn it!
Before we wrap up, what didn't we talk about? I know there's all the. Maybe you can throw in what your predictions are for some of the litigation or whatever you want to say as we wrap things up. Jen, you first.
I think we are finally seeing the beginnings of accountability. We're talking about people having perverse incentives. I think you're going to have this domino effect that we've already seen begin in Georgia, where one after another pleads out because these people realize, oh, heck, I don't want to go to jail for this guy. And so one after another, they're going to go down. It's been very mild so far, but Donald Trump is beginning to get sanctioned for threatening people for the first time in his life. So I think Americans have been frustrated because we think they get away with everything. They think that, nothing matters. Remember that adage? But it actually does. And I have to commend everybody up to the Supreme Court that our courts, our judicial system has a certain integrity to it that does work under difficult circumstances. Not always, not in every place, not in Judge Cannon's courtroom, not in the Supreme Court, but in most places. And that there is, I think, a day of reckoning, which in and of itself has a salutary effect on people's behaviors, on lawyering, and hopefully on government, that people realize you cannot do this and just go on with your life.
I love that. I love that. What about you, Brian?
Well, as for the book, thank you for coming forward, Cassidy. I wish you make as much money as you possibly can off the book. I still find parts of it hard to swallow, but nonetheless, good luck to you. God bless. As for the rest of it, I still maintain that, and what we've seen, Jen, I agree with everything that you just said. We are seeing the beginning of accountability. Georgia, they're peeling away at people. They're falling like flies. Donald Trump, if he's smart, he'll make a deal now before he faces 3 10-year sentences. Concurrent or consecutive won't matter. But at the end of the day, I think what we're looking at there, I still maintain, I still believe wholeheartedly that Donald Trump will not be the candidate for the Republican Party in 2024, facing 91 felony charges in 4 different jurisdictions, and him about to lose. It isn't a matter of, as we've seen in New York, it isn't a matter of whether or not he's guilty of fraud. There's a summary judgment. What they're discussing in New York is
libel. Libel, not guilty, libel.
Yeah, libel. All right. I like the term guilty. I'm not an attorney.
I know, but
guilty bastard. But he's liable for fraud. They're not arguing about that. They're arguing about how much it's going to cost him. And so at the end of the day, Donald Trump could end up losing at least all of his holdings in the state of New York. And if they're able to reach out past that, I don't think they can, then it's going to hurt him even more. So he's telling to me was after he got fined that $10,000 for, shooting his mouth off when he shouldn't. I'm telling you, 5 minutes later, there was an email out asking for more money from his supporters because he had just been fined 10 grand. Donald Trump has no business. His business is grifting people and his supporters. That's the most successful business he's ever had. And the chickens are coming home to roost. And I do not believe he'll be the candidate in 2024. And I think this country, for a variety of reasons, and I think this country will be far better once he's gone. I love to see the federal government take Alcatraz, call it, Mar-a-Lago West, and let Donnie spend the remainder of his life on that compound with a tennis court or whatever he wants, his Secret Service agents, and charging $20 for anyone who wants to come and visit him behind a cage for a couple of hours a day as he throws poo at us like the rest of the orangutans. So that's where I'd love to see it.
From your lips to God's ears about the Republicans dumping this guy. For a while, I thought so. And now I think these people are so into their cult and are so incapable of exercising any rational judgment. I wish I had your confidence, Brian. I really do.
That's from being down in Congress. The guy that got the nod, Johnson, it's not that anybody loved him. Look, he wasn't the first, second, third, fourth. He was the bottom of the barrel. And at the end of the day, they were so worn down, and I can't even adequately describe the situation. Having passed that building, that conference room in Longworth and in the Capitol, it smelled of stale coffee, cigarettes, beer, pizza boxes, cigars, BO. And after 3 weeks of fighting it out, I think they just went, I don't care. Just give me somebody.
Well, so on that note, they better get working. We've got a budget to pass. We've got wars across the globe in 2 locations.
November 17th is the first deadline. That's for funding the government. And today, that's the new Speaker of the House met with the president. That was the question I asked in the Rose Garden yesterday. When would they have him? They had him today. So that tells me that, and I still have faith, Biden has an ability to make deals that none of the Republicans have ever had.
Right.
And he's gotten people to work together, even those full of nonsense. And those in the Matt Gaetz far right end who say, this is MAGA Mike, the hell with him.
Well, I mean, we could just talk forever, you guys. I love having you together. But sad to say, we have to draw this to a close. Thank you for reading Enough by Cassidy Hutchinson and bringing your insights to that and the state of the world and cheering me up. I'm going to focus on science and the useful arts. I feel like I'm quoting the Constitution section on copyright protection, but there you go. Thanks so much for joining me.
It was a pleasure.
Loved it.
As you can tell, we could have, as with so many of my other guests, continued the conversation into, I don't know, another half hour, another hour, another few more, glass of wine, dinner. I know Jen and Brian in real life. I guess I first met them online, but we've seen each other in real life. And it's been a while that we've all been together, and it was a pleasure. I think I'm realizing now that we maybe didn't do a great job of distinguishing between which Jen was which Jen, although I think when Brian said Jen, he was almost exclusively referring to Jen Rubin because his comments were, responding to something she had just said. But, you definitely let me know if you can't tell our voices apart or if that was confusing. We always love to get your feedback. Please let us know what you think. Send me an email to bookedup@politicon.com. And you can also write to me at P.O. Box 147, Northampton, Massachusetts, 01061. I love getting mail. I love getting books and that P.O. Box. It's a super fun treat to go do that. I want to also thank you for sticking with us. I will be back again next week with another show as we continue to explore the writing process and the nonfiction world together. To keep up with the show and our featured authors, please follow Booked Up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And remember to give us a 5-star review. It really will help other people find the podcast.